The morning mist hung thick over Millbrook Hollow when the ships came down from the sky. Jake Crawford had been up since before dawn, same as every day for the past 40 years, checking his moonshine still hidden deep in the woods behind his cabin. The old man moved through the trees like a ghost, knowing every root and rock by heart. His grandfather had taught him these paths during Prohibition, and his father had used them during the Coal Wars. Now Jake used them to keep the federal boys from finding his business. The first ship appeared through the fog like a dark shadow, bigger than any helicopter Jake had ever seen. It moved without sound, which bothered him more than if it had been loud. Things that big should make noise. The ship settled into the clearing near the old church, and two more followed behind it. Jake crouched behind a fallen log and watched strange beings step out into the morning air. They looked almost human from a distance, but something was wrong about the way they moved. Too smooth, too careful. Like they were afraid the ground might break under their feet. They wore dark uniforms that seemed to shimmer in the weak sunlight, and they carried weapons that looked nothing like any gun Jake had ever seen. The beings spread out across the clearing in perfect formation, checking devices that beeped and flashed with colored lights. Jake had seen enough government raids to know trouble when it came calling. He pulled out his old radio, the one Pete Bennett had fixed up with extra range, and clicked it 3 times. Somewhere else in the hollow, Betty Murphy would hear that signal and know to pass it along. Within minutes, every family within 20 miles would know that strangers had arrived, and not the friendly kind. The leader of the strangers stepped forward and did something that made Jake's blood run cold. The thing raised one of those fancy weapons and pointed it at the Crawford family cabin down the hill. Jake could see his nephew Billy working on a truck in the yard, completely unaware of the danger above him. The weapon made a high whining sound and shot a beam of purple light straight at Billy. Jake held his breath, waiting for Billy to fall down dead. Instead, his nephew just stopped working and looked around with a confused expression on his face. The purple light hit Billy square in the chest and seemed to bounce right off him like water off a duck's back. Billy scratched his head, shrugged, and went back to fixing his truck. The strangers looked at each other in what Jake figured was confusion. Their leader tried the weapon again, this time aiming at old Henry Murphy, who was feeding his chickens near the road. Same thing happened. The purple light hit Henry, and Henry just kept throwing corn to his birds like nothing had occurred. Jake grinned to himself. These fancy strangers might have come from somewhere far away, but they clearly did not understand what they were dealing with. The Crawford, Bennett, and Murphy families had been living in these mountains for more than 100 years. They had survived mine collapses, government raids, revenue agents, strip mining companies, and every other kind of trouble that outsiders could bring. A few strangers with fancy toys were not going to change that. The leader of the strangers pulled out a device and started talking into it. Jake could not understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. The thing was getting frustrated. After a few minutes, the device started making sounds that almost sounded like English, though the accent was strange. "Attention, primitive humans," the voice said, echoing across the hollow. "You will surrender immediately or face elimination. Your weapons are useless against our technology. Your resistance is pointless." Jake almost laughed out loud. These strangers thought the people of Millbrook Hollow were primitive. They had no idea that Pete Bennett could build a radio that could reach the moon, or that Sue Ellen Murphy had enough medical training to patch up anyone who got hurt in a fight. They did not know that every person in the hollow had been hunting these woods since they could walk, or that the old mine shafts and caves made perfect hiding places. Most importantly, they did not know that threatening mountain folk was about the worst mistake a person could make. Jake keyed his radio. "Betty, you hearing this nonsense?" Loud and clear, Jake, came Betty Murphy's voice. "These boys think they're dealing with easy targets. Well, I reckon it's time we showed them different." Jake worked his way through the woods toward his cabin, moving slow and quiet. He had learned these skills during 3 tours in Vietnam, and the years since had only made him better at staying invisible. By the time he reached his back door, the strangers were moving down the hill in formation, clearly planning to search every building in the hollow. Jake slipped into his cabin and opened the gun safe his grandfather had built into the wall. The old Winchester was still in perfect condition, and Jake had enough ammunition to fight a small war. He also grabbed the emergency bag that every mountain family kept ready, filled with food, first aid supplies, and other necessities. His grandfather had taught him to always be prepared for trouble. And trouble had definitely arrived. Outside, Jake could hear the strangers moving through the hollow, their strange weapons making that high whining sound. But he also heard something else. The sound of screen doors closing, engines starting up, and people moving through the woods. The hollow was coming alive, and not in the way the strangers expected. Jake slipped back outside and made his way to the old oak tree behind his cabin. Carved into the bark was a symbol his grandfather had put there during the Cold Wars, marking a hiding spot that the government boys had never found. Jake reached into the hollow space and pulled out a radio that Pete had specially modified for emergencies. This one could reach frequencies that most people did not even know existed. "This is Jake Crawford calling all stations," he said into the radio. "We got uninvited guests in the hollow and they ain't here to be neighborly. Time to remind them that mountain folk don't take kindly to threats." The responses came back immediately from hidden positions all through the hills. Danny Crawford from the North Ridge, Lucy Bennett from the old mine entrance, Pete Murphy from his workshop, and dozens of others. Each voice confirmed what Jake already knew. The people of Millbrook Hollow were ready for whatever these strangers wanted to bring. The strangers had made their first mistake by thinking the folks in these mountains were helpless. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The second day brought more confusion for the strangers and more opportunity for the mountain folk. Commander Velthar, as Jake had learned the leader was called from intercepting their radio chatter, had spent the night trying to figure out why his weapons did not work on the humans. His soldiers had set up a camp in the town center, complete with energy barriers and sensor equipment that looked impressive, but did not seem to be doing much good. Billy Crawford watched the alien camp from his garage, sipping coffee and working on a carburetor like it was any other morning. The purple light weapons had hit him 6 more times since yesterday, and each time he just felt a little tingly, like touching a weak electric fence. His cousin Danny had the same experience, and so did everyone else the strangers had tried to shoot. "You reckon they're trying to kill us, or just annoy us to death?" Billy asked his Uncle Jake over the radio. "Hard to say," Jake replied from his position in the woods, "but they sure are getting worked up about it." The truth was simpler than the aliens could imagine. Generations of drinking water that flowed through old mines, eating wild plants that grew in mineral-rich soil, and consuming moonshine that could strip paint, had given the local population a unique resistance to the neural disruptors. What should have knocked out a human nervous system just felt like a mild electric shock to folks who had been building up immunities their whole lives. Pete Bennett had been having the most fun with the situation. The local electronics expert had managed to tap into the alien communication system using a combination of ham radio equipment, car batteries, and some creative rewiring. Every time the aliens tried to coordinate their movements, Pete would break in with helpful suggestions. "Y'all might want to check that south ridge," Pete would say in his slow mountain drawl. "Danny Crawford's got eyes on you from up there, and he's got his deer rifle with him." The aliens would immediately redirect their patrols to the south ridge, where they would find nothing but empty woods and a few confused squirrels. Meanwhile, the real ambush would be waiting somewhere completely different. Sue Ellen Bennett had turned her veterinary clinic into a field hospital, though so far the only casualties had been alien pride and a few bruised egos. She had also been experimenting with some of her tranquilizer supplies, creating non-lethal traps that left alien soldiers unconscious, but unharmed. Sue Ellen had no desire to actually hurt anyone, but she was perfectly willing to inconvenience them until they decided to leave. The aliens' advanced technology kept running into the simple reality that mountain folk had been dealing with problems using whatever they had on hand for generations. When the aliens set up motion sensors, Lucy Crawford's teenage son Tommy defeated them by throwing rocks in one direction while sneaking past in another. When they used heat sensors, the locals covered themselves in mud from the creek and moved through the water where their body heat would not show up. Commander Velthar was beginning to understand that he had made a serious error in judgment. His intelligence reports had described Earth humans as a primitive species, with limited technology and simple social structures. Nothing in those reports had mentioned that some human communities had survived for generations by being smarter, tougher, and more adaptable than anyone who tried to control them. "Sir," his technology officer reported during their morning briefing, "the humans continue to interfere with our communications. They appear to be using primitive radio equipment modified with components from our own systems." "How is that possible?" Velthar demanded. "We are not certain, sir. Our analysis suggests they have somehow reverse-engineered our quantum processing units using what appears to be copper wire, car batteries, and a substance they call duct tape. Velthar stared at the report. His people had spent centuries developing quantum communication technology, and these primitive humans had figured out how to hack it using materials they found in their garages. The psychological warfare was getting worse every day. The humans seemed to take genuine pleasure in making the aliens uncomfortable. Strange sounds echoed through the hills at night, from mournful singing to what sounded like wild animals but probably was not. Lights appeared and disappeared in patterns that meant nothing but suggested surveillance. The aliens' sleep cycles were being disrupted by a campaign of creative harassment that never quite crossed the line into actual violence. Amy Murphy, who had just graduated from college with a degree in anthropology, had been watching the aliens with scientific curiosity rather than hostility, unlike her neighbors who treated the invasion as just another outside threat to be dealt with. Amy was fascinated by the cultural implications of first contact. She had noticed that the aliens moved in rigid formations and seemed uncomfortable when those patterns were disrupted. They also appeared to be confused by human behavior that did not fit their expectations. Amy began to suspect that the aliens were not evil conquerors, but rather a military force operating under assumptions that were completely wrong. "Grandma Betty," Amy said during one of their evening radio check-ins, "I think these aliens are more scared than we are." "What makes you say that, honey?" Betty Murphy replied. "Look at how they're acting. They're staying bunched up in the center of town like they're afraid to spread out. Their weapons don't work on us, but they keep trying the same thing over and over. They're not acting like conquerors. They're acting like people who are in over their heads." Amy's observation was more accurate than she knew. Commander Velthar had expected to spend a few hours eliminating a primitive population, and then report back to the fleet with a successful test of their pacification protocols. Instead, he was dealing with humans who seemed immune to their weapons, impossible to intimidate, and disturbingly competent at asymmetric warfare. Worse, his soldiers were beginning to lose confidence. Zephyrian military doctrine was based on technological superiority and psychological intimidation. When both failed, they had no backup plan except to wait for reinforcements that might never come. The humans, meanwhile, were settling into what they clearly considered a normal routine. They tended their gardens, repaired their equipment, and went about their daily business as if having alien invaders in town was just another minor inconvenience. Children played in the woods around the alien perimeter, and teenagers treated the whole situation as an interesting distraction from summer boredom. Jake Crawford summed up the local attitude during his evening radio broadcast. "Folks, I know we got strangers camping in our town square, and I know they're not exactly friendly. But we've dealt with government agents, coal company security, and revenue officers. These boys might have fancier equipment, but they don't seem any smarter than the usual run of troublemakers." The message was clear. The people of Millbrook Hollow had outlasted every other group that had tried to control them. They were prepared to outlast these strangers too, no matter how long it took or how strange their weapons might be. By the end of the first week, Commander Velthar was facing a situation that no Zephyrian military academy had prepared him for. What should have been a simple extermination mission had turned into a complex guerrilla war against opponents who seemed to treat the entire conflict as an elaborate game. His daily reports to the Imperial fleet were becoming increasingly difficult to write without sounding completely incompetent. The humans had transformed their small community into a maze of tunnels, hidden passages, and carefully placed obstacles that made movement dangerous for anyone who did not know the terrain. Jimmy Murphy, a former coal miner with 30 years of underground experience, had been leading the excavation efforts. The mountain was already riddled with old mine shafts and natural caves, and Jimmy knew every inch of the underground network. "These tunnels connect pretty much everywhere," Jimmy explained to Jake during one of their planning sessions in the old Murphy mine. "We can move from the church to the general store to the Bennett farm without ever showing ourselves above ground. And if we need to disappear completely, there's passages that lead clear up to the ridgeline." The tunnel system was giving the aliens constant headaches. Their sensors would detect human movement in one location, only to have their targets appear somewhere completely different minutes later. Patrols sent to investigate underground passages would find themselves lost in a network of interconnected tunnels that seemed to shift and Change every time they explored them. Pete Bennett had been having the time of his life with the alien technology. Every piece of equipment the invaders brought down was fair game for his creative modifications. Motion sensors became early warning systems for the human defenders. Communication devices were reprogrammed to broadcast local weather reports and bluegrass music. Energy weapons were carefully disassembled and their power cells used to run everything from radios to coffee makers. The thing about fancy technology, Pete explained to his nephew while rewiring an alien scanner, is that it's still just circuits and power sources when you get down to it. These folks might be from outer space, but electricity works the same way everywhere. Commander Velthar's technology officer had given up trying to explain how the humans were consistently defeating their advanced systems. The reports were starting to read like fantasy novels rather than military intelligence. Primitive humans using copper wire and automotive parts to hack quantum processors. Stone Age weapons modified with energy cells to create hybrid devices that should not exist. Communication networks that operated on frequencies their own equipment could not even detect. The psychological warfare campaign was reaching new levels of creativity. Lucy Crawford, the former high school drama teacher, had organized what she called Operation Spook Show. Every night brought new supernatural experiences for the alien soldiers. Glowing lights moved through the trees in patterns that suggested intelligence but followed no logic. Voices called out in languages that sounded almost familiar but conveyed no meaning. Strange music drifted down from the hills, sometimes beautiful and sometimes deeply unsettling. The aliens were discovering that humans had a remarkable talent for psychological manipulation when they put their minds to it. Their advanced training had prepared them for direct combat, technological warfare, and even diplomatic negotiations. Nobody had taught them how to deal with opponents who specialized in making life just uncomfortable enough to be maddening without ever quite crossing the line into open warfare. Sue Ellen Bennett had established a field hospital in her clinic, but she was also running what amounted to a prisoner exchange program. Alien soldiers who wandered too far from their main camp would find themselves waking up in her clinic, treated for minor injuries and offered home-cooked meals before being released with detailed directions back to their base. The aliens were confused by this treatment, which seemed genuinely caring despite the circumstances. "Why do you help us?" one of the alien soldiers asked Sue Ellen through a translation device. "We came here to eliminate your people." "Well, honey," Sue Ellen replied while bandaging a cut on the alien's arm, "just because y'all made poor choices doesn't mean you deserve to suffer unnecessarily. Besides, maybe if we treat you decent, you'll think twice about this whole elimination business." The alien soldier left the clinic with clean bandages, a full stomach, and a completely different perspective on human nature than his training had provided. Word of Sue Ellen's treatment spread through the alien ranks, creating the first cracks in their military discipline. Soldiers began to question whether the humans were really the primitive savages they had been told to expect. Amy Murphy had been conducting her own investigation into alien culture and motivation. She had managed to establish limited communication with several of the invaders, using a combination of gestures, drawings, and patience. What she learned was disturbing in ways that had nothing to do with invasion or conquest. "Jake," Amy reported during one of their evening meetings, "I don't think these aliens are here because they want to be. From what I can understand, their homeworld is dying. They're not conquerors, they're refugees looking for somewhere to live." "That changes things," Jake admitted. "Fighting off invaders is one thing. Dealing with homeless folks is something else entirely." The revelation began to spread through the human community, changing the nature of the conflict in ways that neither side had anticipated. The mountain folk had no experience with interstellar politics or galactic empires, but they had plenty of experience with people who had been forced from their homes by circumstances beyond their control. The coal industry had created several generations of economic refugees in these mountains, and the local communities had learned to help each other survive when outsiders made life difficult. Commander Velthar was facing pressure from his superiors to resolve the situation quickly, but his options were becoming more limited every day. His soldiers were demoralized by their inability to defeat what should have been primitive opponents. His equipment was being systematically captured and repurposed by humans who treated advanced technology like broken appliances that just needed the right kind of fixing. Worst of all, his troops were beginning to show signs of something that Zephyrian military doctrine claimed was impossible: They were starting to like the humans they were supposed to eliminate. The breaking point came when young Tommy Crawford, Lucy's teenage son, was caught trying to sneak into the alien camp. Instead of attempting sabotage, the boy had been trying to trade homemade cookies for a chance to examine alien technology up close. The alien guards who caught him were so confused by the gesture that they actually accepted the trade, spending an hour showing Tommy how their energy weapons worked, while eating what they later described as the most delicious food they had ever tasted. "Sir," Velthar's second-in-command reported, "the humans appear to be attempting to befriend our soldiers." Velthar stared at the report. In 40 years of military service, he had never encountered an enemy that responded to invasion by offering baked goods. The tactical situation was becoming more complicated by the day, and he was beginning to suspect that standard military solutions were not going to work against opponents who treated warfare as an opportunity to make new friends. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday morning when Amy Murphy decided to take a more direct approach to understanding their uninvited guests. She had been watching the alien soldiers for 2 weeks, and she was convinced that military action was not the answer to whatever was really happening in Millbrook Hollow. Armed with a thermos of coffee, a plate of her grandmother's biscuits, and a determination that had gotten her through 4 years of college, Amy walked straight up to the alien perimeter. The guards were so surprised by her direct approach that they almost forgot to point their weapons at her. Amy held up her hands to show she was not carrying anything dangerous, then sat down on a tree stump just outside their energy barrier and started eating breakfast. She made a point of enjoying every bite, and the smell of fresh biscuits and hot coffee began to drift toward the alien positions. After about 20 minutes, one of the guards approached the barrier. Amy could see curiosity in the aliens' posture, even though she could not read the expressions on their strange faces. She held up a biscuit and gestured toward the guard, making it clear she was offering to share her food. The guard looked around nervously, then said something in their own language. Another alien appeared, this one wearing different insignia that Amy guessed meant higher rank. The two aliens talked briefly. Then the second one activated a translation device. "Human female, you are in violation of security protocols. Return to your dwelling immediately." "Can't do that," Amy replied cheerfully. "I'm having breakfast, and my grandmother always said it was rude not to offer food to visitors." "Y'all look like you could use a good meal." The alien commander seemed confused by her response. "We are not visitors. We are an occupation force. You will comply with our directives." "Well, that's where we have a problem," Amy said, pouring herself another cup of coffee. "See, around here, anyone who shows up uninvited and starts making demands is either law enforcement or family. Since y'all clearly aren't from around here and you don't look like any government agents I've seen, I'm thinking you must be the family category. And family doesn't get to give orders until after they've explained what's wrong and asked for help." The alien commander stared at her for a long moment. Amy could practically see the gears turning in his head as he tried to process human logic that made no sense according to his training. Finally, he said something to the guard who moved away from the barrier. "You believe we are family?" "Not yet," Amy admitted. "But you could be if you wanted to be. That's how it works around here. You show up, you explain your situation, you ask for help instead of demanding it, and folks will see what they can do for you. Of course, if you show up shooting at people, that tends to complicate things." Over the next hour, Amy managed to establish the first real communication between the two sides. The alien commander, who told her his name was something like Velthar, gradually revealed information that changed everything Amy thought she knew about the invasion. The Zephyrians were not conquerors in the traditional sense. Their homeworld was dying as their sun cooled prematurely, a natural disaster that would kill their entire species within a few generations. They had been searching the galaxy for a new home, but every suitable world they found was already occupied by species that were either too advanced to defeat or too primitive to displace without committing genocide. Earth was supposed to be different, Velthar explained through his translation device. Our surveys indicated a young species with primitive technology and simple social structures. We thought we could establish small colonies without significant resistance, then gradually expand as your people adapted to our presence. "So you figured you'd just wipe out a few small towns to make room for yourselves?" Amy asked. Velthar's response came slowly, and Amy could hear something like shame in his translated words. "Our survival depends on finding a new home. We believe that eliminating small populations would be more humane than trying to conquer your entire planet. Amy stared at the alien commander for a long moment, processing what she had just learned. These were not evil invaders trying to destroy humanity. They were desperate refugees who had made terrible decisions because they saw no other choice. It was still wrong, but it was the kind of wrong that came from desperation rather than malice. "Velthar," Amy said finally, "has anyone ever explained to you how things work when people need help? I do not understand." See, the thing is, when folks are in trouble and need somewhere to live, the normal thing to do is ask. You explain your situation, you offer to contribute something useful, and you see if people are willing to help. You don't start by shooting at them. But your species is primitive. We assumed you would not understand our needs or be capable of assisting us. Amy almost laughed. "Mister, you've been trying to eliminate a town full of mountain folk for 2 weeks. And the worst thing that's happened to your people is they've been getting too many home-cooked meals. If that's what you call primitive, you might want to reconsider your assumptions." The conversation continued for most of the morning, with other aliens gradually joining in as word spread through their camp. Amy learned that the Zephyrian force was actually quite small, only a few hundred individuals who had been sent as an advanced scouting party. Their mission was to test human defenses and establish secure landing zones for the main refugee fleet, which was still months away from reaching Earth. She also learned that the aliens had been just as confused by human behavior as the humans had been by alien technology. Their weapons failed because human physiology was different from what their intelligence reports had predicted. Their tactics failed because human social structures were far more complex and adaptable than they had understood. Most importantly, Amy learned that many of the alien soldiers were having serious doubts about their mission. They had expected to face primitive savages, not people who treated them with kindness even while defending their homes. The experience was forcing them to question everything they had been told about Earth and humanity. "Velthar," Amy said as their conversation began to wind down, "I think you and I need to arrange a proper meeting between your people and mine. Not as invaders and defenders, but as people trying to solve a problem. You would do this? After what we have done?" "Well, you haven't actually managed to hurt anyone yet," Amy pointed out. "And from what you're telling me, you're in a pretty desperate situation. Around here, we help people who need help, especially when they've got children depending on them." Amy stood up and gathered her breakfast things. "I'm going to talk to my people. You should talk to yours. Tomorrow morning, same time, same place. We'll see if we can figure out a way to solve your problems without anyone getting hurt." As she walked back toward town, Amy could hear excited conversations breaking out in the alien camp behind her. For the first time since the invasion began, both sides were talking about possibilities instead of just problems. It was going to be a very interesting conversation when she explained to her neighbors that their invaders were actually refugees who needed help rather than enemies who needed to be defeated. The war for Millbrook Hollow was about to become something much more complicated and much more hopeful. 6 months after the failed invasion, Millbrook Hollow had become something that nobody could have predicted, and everyone agreed was working better than anyone had a right to expect. The transformation had not been easy, but mountain folk had never been afraid of hard work. And it turned out that Zephyrians were not afraid of hard work either, when they were not busy trying to eliminate people. The morning sun rose over a community that looked almost the same as it had before the aliens arrived, except for the small details that marked how much everything had changed. Solar collectors that definitely had not come from any Earth factory-powered homes that now had heating systems that could keep a cabin warm in January, using 1/10 of the wood they used to require. Gardens grew in neat rows that produced twice as much food as they had before, thanks to alien knowledge of soil enhancement and plant genetics combined with local knowledge of what would actually grow in mountain weather. Jake Crawford stood on his front porch, drinking coffee and watching his neighbor Velthar adjust the settings on a water purification system that cleaned creek water better than any filter the EPA had ever dreamed of. The alien had taken to human clothing and human names with the enthusiasm of someone who had never had the chance to choose his own identity before. He still looked obviously non-human, but he moved like someone who belonged in the mountains now. "Morning." "Victor," Jake called out using the name Velthar had chosen for himself. "Good morning, Jake. The water system is operating at full efficiency. Your creek will be cleaner today than it has been in 50 years. Appreciate that. You want some coffee? Betty Murphy brought over some of her cinnamon rolls yesterday. Victor's face attempted what Jake had learned was the alien equivalent of a smile. That would be very welcome. Betty's cooking is better than anything our food synthesizers ever produced. The integration had been easier than anyone expected, mostly because both species turned out to have similar ideas about community and mutual support. The Zephyrians had been living under military discipline for so long that they had forgotten what it was like to be part of a civilian community. The mountain folk had experience with incorporating outsiders, whether they were relatives moving back home after factory jobs, disappeared, or strangers who showed up needing a place to stay and work. Pete Bennett's electronics shop had become the unofficial research and development center for human-alien cooperation. His workbench was covered with devices that combined the best of both technologies, usually in ways that would have horrified engineers from either species. A quantum processor running on battery power from a car, an alien communication device that could pick up radio signals from 3 star systems and also receive broadcasts from the local country music station. The thing is, Pete explained to a group of visiting scientists from the university, their technology is real sophisticated, but it's designed to work in perfect conditions with perfect components. Our technology is designed to work when half the parts are broke and the other half are held together with duct tape. When you combine them, you get something that's sophisticated enough to do amazing things, but tough enough to keep working when your kid hits it with a baseball. Sue Ellen Bennett had revolutionized medicine for both species. Her combination of alien healing technology and human practical experience had created treatments that neither side could have developed alone. She could now heal injuries that would have been permanent disabilities. But she had also taught the aliens the value of simple remedies like chicken soup and enough rest. Turns out, Sue Ellen told anyone who would listen, healing is healing whether you're dealing with humans or aliens. Bodies want to get better if you give them the right support and don't get in their way too much. The children had adapted fastest of all. Human kids and Zephyrian youngsters played together with the unconscious ease that only children could manage, creating games that required capabilities from both species and establishing friendships that were already forming the foundation for the next generation of cooperation. Amy Murphy had become the unofficial ambassador between the two communities, a role that suited her anthropology background and her natural curiosity about how different cultures could work together. She spent her days documenting the integration process, partly for her own research and partly because she suspected that Millbrook Hollow was creating a model that other communities might need to use someday. What we're doing here is not magic, Amy wrote in her journal. It's just people from different backgrounds finding ways to help each other solve problems. The aliens needed somewhere to live and contribute. We needed help with some problems that our technology could not solve. Both sides were willing to work and share and compromise. The only thing that makes it special is that one group happened to come from another star. The success had attracted attention from both the human and Zephyrian governments, neither of which had been entirely pleased with the independent solution their citizens had worked out. Federal agents had visited twice, asking pointed questions about technology transfer and unauthorized diplomatic contact. The Zephyrian fleet had sent several messages demanding status, reports, and expressing concern about cultural contamination of their people. Both communities had responded to government pressure with the polite but firm independence that mountain folk had been perfecting for generations. Yes, they were sharing technology, but only improvements that made life better for everyone. Yes, they were establishing relationships with alien refugees, but only on terms that respected everyone's rights and needs. No, they were not interested in letting outside authorities make decisions about their community without their input. Seems to me, Jake had told the last group of federal investigators, that we solved a problem that nobody else wanted to deal with, and we did it without hurting anyone or breaking any laws that matter. If Washington wants to do something different, they're welcome to try, but they'll have to do it somewhere else. The Zephyrian response had been even more direct. Commander Velthar had formally resigned from the Imperial fleet and requested political asylum on Earth. Most of his soldiers had followed his example, choosing to become refugees seeking permanent residence rather than military personnel following orders. The integration was not perfect. Cultural misunderstandings still happened regularly, usually involving food, social customs, or the proper way to repair mechanical equipment. Some humans remained suspicious of their alien neighbors, and some Zephyrians struggled with the informal social structures that governed mountain communities. But both groups were working through their differences with the patient determination of people who had decided they wanted to build something together. The real test came when the first winter arrived. Zephyrians had never experienced snow, and their cold weather preparations were completely inadequate for an Appalachian winter. The human community responded the way mountain folk always responded to neighbors in trouble. Families opened their homes, shared their heating fuel, and taught practical skills for surviving when the temperature dropped below zero for weeks at a time. By spring, the Zephyrians were not just surviving mountain winters, they were enjoying them. Alien children built snowmen and went sledding with human kids. Alien adults learned to appreciate the beauty of snow-covered forests and the satisfaction of keeping a wood fire burning through a long, cold night. "You know what I think?" Betty Murphy said during one of their evening radio conversations as the community settled in for another peaceful night. "I think we got ourselves something pretty special here. Not just because we got alien neighbors, but because we proved that people can work things out if they're willing to try." Jake Crawford looked out his window at the lights scattered across the hollow, some powered by human technology and some by alien science, all keeping families warm and safe through another mountain evening. "Reckon you're right, Betty. Reckon this old hollow's got room for just about anyone willing to work hard and treat folks decent." In the distance, the sound of laughter drifted through the night air, human voices and alien voices blending together in the timeless sound of children playing games that would have been impossible before two different worlds learned to share the same community.